thank you very much. So I'm Karen Ellis. I lead the Private Sector and Markets programme here at ODI, and we focus on how the private sector contributes to development and how government policy can shape the conditions within which the private sector operates in a way that maximises the contribution to development. And we have within that a programme looking specifically at how low carbon growth or green growth can be promoted through private sector investment and innovation. And this piece of work is quite exciting because this issue of low carbon competitiveness is not well understood and not well analysed, particularly from a developing country perspective. And the focus of our work is particularly on low-income countries. And it's a potentially really important part of the story, I think, on low carbon growth. So it's something we do need to understand more. Now, if I can get this to work, great. The first thing is to say is that we are presenting the outcomes of just the first phase of this work. So I'm going to talk first about the sort of concept and rationale for the work, and then Alberto is going to present some selected findings from the country work that we've done to date. And then I'll finish up briefly by talking about the sort of emerging overall story and next steps for this programme. So, the hypothesis that this whole programme is based on, there's basically three parts of it. The first is that climate change, international mitigation policies, and natural resource scarcity will transform global trade patterns. And I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. The second part of the hypothesis is that this will affect competitiveness and will create both opportunities and threats for developing countries in terms of their sources of growth going forward. And let me just define competitiveness. We mean when a country is able to compete on world markets, able to export successfully, and also to sell domestically without being outcompeted by imports. So quite a narrow, relatively narrow definition actually of competitiveness compared with some others. And the third part of the hypothesis is that these competitiveness-related drivers create incentives for low-carbon growth. Question mark around that. There are also some trade-offs, but we need to understand both the synergies and the trade-offs. So let's look at these three drivers that I mentioned in more detail. So what we've done is to build an analytical framework which assesses the impact of each of these drivers on 5 different sectors of the economy. And these are energy, agriculture, manufacturing, forestry, and tourism. And we chose those sectors because they are ones which low-income countries are, very important to many low-income countries. And we've identified a number of different transmission mechanisms through which these three drivers are likely to affect the different sectors. And we won't go into that in any detail here. We don't really have time, but it's all in the working paper which is available online. I just want to give some examples of the kinds of things we're talking about here. So, natural resource scarcity. The first one to mention is really energy prices, because energy prices are already extremely high in low-income countries, and there's very poor access to energy, and energy is extremely unreliable. There's lots of load shedding and blackouts, and this massively undermines the competitiveness of many sectors within low-income countries. Now, this is going to get worse because energy prices are expected to rise going forward. Most projections show oil price rises increasing by 1.5 to 2.5% per annum in real terms to 2035. Similarly, both gas and coal prices are still expected to rise until at least this decade. Can everybody hear me all right? Yeah? Okay. So this is going to be a major issue for low-income countries if they don't adapt, because they tend to be more energy intensive than richer countries. So they will be relatively disadvantaged in their competitiveness vis-à-vis other countries. A second issue around natural resource scarcity is increased competition for land and water resources. And this is being driven by increased demand for food and also for biofuels and other commodities, coming largely from emerging market growth, actually, and both economic growth and population growth. This is going to increase food prices, etc., which will be a challenge for consumers, but it's also an opportunity for producers in low-income countries. we hear a lot about land grabs, and this is a symptom of this trend, because it is where foreign firms are trying to get access, or keep hold of access to land and water going forward. Sometimes they're not even using this land, but in future they think it will be worth their while to have this land in order to generate food and export it or import it into the country, the host country of that firm. This is a risk for the low-income countries that host this FDI, but it's also an opportunity if they can manage it appropriately to improve their productivity and competitiveness and to have spillover effects which could stimulate improved competitiveness and growth going forward. So they're the two, I guess, key issues in natural resource scarcity. The second driver is climate change mitigation. Now, we actually wanted this to be the whole focus of our study, but we realised the pace at which international mitigation policy is being agreed is so slow. It's not clear when an international agreement is ever going to actually, have a real impact on carbon pricing and emission ceilings, etc. So, in fact, the natural resource scarcity is a much more important driver, generally speaking, at this point. Nonetheless, it seems inevitable that climate change mitigation policies will kick in more and more over time. Countries are beginning to introduce their own mitigation policies even without an international agreement, and so it's pretty much inevitable. Over, I guess, a decade or so, we will see more and more of that kind of policy affecting trading patterns. So here we're talking about things like carbon footprinting, for example, where you try and measure the actual carbon associated with the production of a particular good. And there are already some standards and certification schemes which attempt to do that, although it's quite challenging at the moment. But over time, you can see that that is quite likely to develop further. And that is, a significant threat for low-income countries if they can't get certified by these sorts of carbon footprinting tools, because they don't have the institutions to do that. Perhaps they don't have the capacity to do that. But it's also an opportunity if they produce in a relatively energy efficient way, and there's evidence that they do in some sectors. For example, they don't use heated greenhouses and artificial lighting, so potentially they are more energy efficient than other countries producing certain agricultural products, and some studies support that. So it could be an advantage if they can show that that is the case going forward. It could improve their access to markets. Another issue around climate change mitigation is, of course, carbon markets and climate finance. Again, as I said, progress has been slow on these things. We're talking about things like the Clean Development Mechanism and RED, emissions trading, of course. These will create opportunities for low-income countries going forward. They haven't done a huge amount for low-income countries to date, but hopefully over time they will do. And that those sources of finance could be used, productively to improve the competitiveness of relevant sectors, in renewable sectors, for example, in low-income countries, if they can position themselves to capitalise on and access that finance and then use it appropriately. There's a whole issue of carbon leakage, which is when richer countries undertake mitigation, so they impose a carbon tax, say, and that forces energy-intensive producers to relocate production to other countries. And potentially low-income countries could benefit in some ways from some of this, if you want to call it benefit, because they could attract more FDI. This is also a risk, however, because it's obviously not a clean development pattern. It's not a low-carbon growth trajectory. So there's lots of controversy around that, although there is also evidence that suggests it's unlikely to be a big effect anyway. And then the third driver is effects of climate change, which you can't ignore because it's going to be significant in some sectors, less important in others. But obviously in the agricultural sector, there will be big impacts, reducing yields for some crops, affecting irrigation requirements, etc. So these will need to be factored in by countries going forward as they work out what their trading patterns and growth strategies will be. It will also affect the potential for some energy sources, especially things like hydropower, which a lot of low-income countries do depend on, and it will affect that going forward. So, how am I doing? Okay. So why is this important? It's important to developing country governments because of all these risks and opportunities that I've just talked about. Awareness is not great in some of these low-income countries about these issues, And there is no real bringing together of these issues around natural resource scarcity, climate change, etc., and competitiveness. There is often documents on both these issues within countries, but they don't bring these two things together at all or consider them holistically. So what we want to do is try and support that kind of thought process and to develop a diagnostic tool that will help countries to go through that thought process. And that's that. So at the moment we're doing that by working with specific countries, and then we want to be able to generalize that approach out and provide a tool that other countries can then use to apply it themselves. And it's really about improving their own economic growth and resilience, and should be something of interest to ministries of trade and industry and ministries of finance, not just ministries of environment, which is where green growth policies usually often sit. Okay, if I'm running out of time, I won't go through this in detail, but this just gives some examples. In fact, Alberto is going to talk about many of these things anyway. It gives some examples of where there's synergies between competitiveness, policies and investments that will promote competitiveness and those that will promote low carbon growth. I'll just talk about the top one maybe. So obviously these are obvious really once you've done the analysis. High and rising energy prices reduce national competitiveness. So investing in renewable energy can reduce dependence on fossil fuels, and that can promote competitiveness in the longer term. But there's many different synergies that we have come across in doing this analysis, and I can't do justice to this now. There's also some trade-offs, so we need to understand that as well. So just to recap, there's 3 questions that we're looking at in this project. How will these 3 drivers affect competitiveness in low-income countries? How will or should policymakers and businesses respond to that? And what are the implications of this for low-carbon growth in terms of identifying both the synergies and the trade-offs between those 2 things? And so now I'll hand over to Alberto to talk about the country specifics.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go through the challenges and the solutions in the energy, manufacturing, agriculture, tourism and forestry sectors, just highlighting some case studies that, some examples that we've come across in our fieldwork of where companies have found opportunities and challenges in these different sectors. So for the first one, for energy, the energy challenges. The first challenge is the choice between renewables and fossil fuels. Investment in fossil fuels right now is cheaper. There's more expertise in it, and it's more widely available, especially in low-income countries. When you can set up a quick diesel generator in rural areas, it's much cheaper than doing a long-term investment in currently more expensive and possibly less reliable renewable energy sources, such as solar or wind power or hydroelectric power, which is also, there's also climatic impacts on these energy sources, i.e. in Kenya and in Nepal they've seen, in Cambodia as well, they've seen reductions in stability of hydroelectric power due to changes in rainfall patterns. So right now there is a trade-off. It is actually more desirable in pure economic terms to invest in thermal energy, traditional sources of energy. But got to keep in mind that renewable energy prices are going down, consistently going down year on year. And for example, solar has gone down quite massively, not just to improvements in technology, but also to competition and Chinese firms massively investing in solar, which has made the price fall down. So eventually we can foresee a point where solar power becomes cheaper to invest in than fossil fuels. And at that point, and so for long-term competitiveness prospects of a country, it's important to keep in mind that cheaper power in the long term through renewables might give your companies a competitive edge. The second issue that we've come across is in terms of generation and access. So the first one is on-grid versus off-grid energy. Lots of low-income countries don't have widespread distribution networks, so there's a net difference between on-grid energy, which is produced by large electric projects, big hydroelectric or large thermal, versus off-grid energy, which are small units. They tend to be they procure a smaller area, perhaps a village or a small cluster of firms in rural areas. So there's the issue of getting this network, even if you have large-scale hydroelectric, for example, getting the energy to your whole country is still an issue. And even off-grid right now, it's slightly easier to invest in fossil fuels. And the other problem in terms of access is that currently in a lot of low-income countries there's a much higher demand for energy than there is a supply. And for example, in Kenya there's about 1,100 megawatts of installed energy. Most of it is hydro, but there's 1,400 megawatts of demand for it. Whereas in Nepal, it's the demand is about 1,600 megawatts. Installed energy is 700, and so that leads to the fact that there's about another 800 unofficial megawatts of self-generating diesel-based energy being produced in both in enterprises and in households. So as a quick solution, fossil fuels generators cheaper right now. And the third issue is that of prices. For a start, energy prices in a lot of these countries are very high, especially compared to other competing countries. For example, if you take prices in Kenya, they are at 16 cents per kilowatt hour, whereas in Korea they are at 6 cents per kilowatt hour. Slightly unfair, but you've got to keep these comparisons in mind for long-term competitiveness if you want to compete at a global level. So these high prices hamper productivity, they hamper competitiveness, the competitiveness of companies. What solutions have we found in terms of energy? Well, first of all, there's a need for localized national solutions. Countries should take advantage of the endowments that they have. And this may mean that in the short term, they could also take advantage of fossil fuels. For example, Kenya has massive geothermal potential, and it could potentially look after all its energy needs just with geothermal, but investment in it takes time. In the meantime, it's also found fossil fuel reservoirs. It's unclear whether these are going to be commercial in the long term or not yet. But if they do prove to be commercial, they could potentially export or import substitute current fossil fuel usage to generate some additional revenues, which can then be used to invest in further geothermal or hydroelectric. But it's also a matter of using what's in the country. Kenya and Cambodia are both also still investing in hydroelectric, and Nepal also has huge, in fact, one of the biggest in the world, potentials for hydroelectric generation, but policy and politics has stopped it from investing in that. A little bit later on that, why that happened. For the wide spectrum approach, it's a sense of using different kinds of energy sources to secure stability, especially when you can not rely as much on traditional, and I don't mean that as fossil fuel, I mean as sources of energy that you would usually use in the country because of changing climatic events or changes in prices. So Kenya can't rely as much on hydro due to variances in rainfall, so it has to diversify and create a wider base of energy use, which it's currently doing. And that helps improve stability and resilience, especially in the face of climate change and changes in fossil fuel prices. And finally, there's the issue of feed-in tariffs and whether these can incentivize investments. We found that where there are feed-in tariffs, there are incentives to invest, both for companies and for households to produce their own energy, and in most cases this will be renewable energy, and sell it back to the power grid. But for example, in Kenya right now, the feed-in tariffs are a bit too low to stimulate large-scale investments. And in Nepal, there are no feed-in tariffs, and neither in Cambodia. So in both cases, whereas in Kenya there is more use of renewables, both in Nepal and Cambodia there's less incentive at the household level unless you really need the energy to invest in renewable energy sources. But feed-in tariffs are preferable to subsidies, as we've seen between Kenya and Nepal. Whilst in Kenya you can revise the feed-in tariff upwards to stimulate more investments. In Nepal, where they've tried to increase energy prices with PPAs, power purchasing agreements, they've had massive negative feedback, i.e. strikes and general protests on the streets because it's a political situation. People don't want to pay higher energy prices. So if you're doing it through the feed-in tariff route, it's much easier, more flexible to renegotiate than if you're fixing it at the national level through PPAs, which Nepal is currently doing, especially for larger scale energy production. Just some photos of diesel generator versus fuel wood generator. On fuel wood on the left and diesel on the right. So just some photos from field work, just to liven it up a bit. Second sector is in the manufacture. So in the manufacturing sector, manufacturing firms, it's more specific to enterprises here, are facing three major problems. They need to secure resources in the long run, including energy, water, crops if they're in agro-processing, and primary materials in other sectors. They're facing high energy prices as well as a lack of access to energy, especially in rural areas. And also they are facing barriers to invest in green technologies, in the sense of financial barriers and a lack of carbon financing in a lot of cases, especially where they were looking for it but couldn't find it. So in terms of securing, high prices are quite an important part of the costs of firms in Kenya, in Nepal and Cambodia. We're talking about up to a quarter of monthly costs go to energy, so that's quite significant in terms of their competitiveness. If these can be reduced, then it gives them a long-term boost to their productivity and their costs and their overall prices. So what solutions have we found in this for the manufacturing sector? Well, a lot of companies have decided to go into self-generation. This lowers costs in the long term. There's usually a return on investment of about 3 to 4 years, so that means that they've recovered all their investment costs within 3 and 4 years, and from then onwards it's just a matter of saving on what they would have spent. But they don't always choose to go green. So whilst sugar factory in Kenya, Mumias Sugar, is using bagasse, which is a natural waste product of sugar processing, to generate 30 megawatts of electricity, a cement company, which is East Africa Portland Cement, has also set up a power plant, but it's decided to go for coal. So it's not always green, but most cases that we found, where there is an availability of natural resources that they can use, they will go green. So KTDA, the Kenya Tea Development Authority, has decided to build micro hydroelectric dams to power its tea processing facilities. And Unilever is growing fuel wood to also help boilers to save energy on coal. To save using coal and using fuel wood in its boiler processes in terms of energy use. So they do use sustainable resources where they can. So and Bamburi Cement as well. A cement company has set up a reforestation program on its previously mined lands to set up sustainable wood source for its to produce energy, but instead of using carbon, it's decided to use wood. And East Africa Cement Company is recycling waste tires for its clinker production process, which is an important component of the cement manufacturing process, which turns out to be less carbon intensive and cheaper to use than traditional cement making processes. And what we found is also a large number of firms are using energy audits and energy efficiency programs to help just overall reduce their energy usage. This can help them actually save quite a lot of money. For example, British American Tobacco in Kenya saved 24% on energy, saves 24% on its energy costs every year, whilst Spinnit, another Kenyan firm, has managed to recover its costs within 3 years, if I remember correctly, and save around $400,000 in the process, compared to just by reducing the use of using less lower intensity light bulbs and other various small things in its manufacturing process to reduce its energy use. Moving on, tourism and forestry. Here we've got a case of exploitation versus conservation in both fields. Exploitation of forest resources or conservation of forest resources, in the sense of increased logging or maintain forests as they are. And for tourism, we're talking about exploiting natural resources for tourism promotion or conserving them, again, as they are for environmental reasons. The second challenge that they come across is the fact that there's a lot of certification requirements, especially for forestry, and non-tariff barriers, so phytosanitary standards and other organic requirements for organic, which a lot of companies, especially in low-income countries, have difficulty meeting, and it raises their production costs. And finally, it's also an issue of access and use of resources, i.e. increasing road access in Nepal to improve tourism access has actually resulted in environmental degradation in some areas. And similarly, if you want to increase the amount of goods being exported from forest areas, which tend to be quite remote, you need to improve land access, which again has environmental consequences. So what kind of solutions have we seen? We've seen issues of changing activities, diversifying not just from timber, but also into the production of non-timber forest products, i.e. essential oils, herbs, etc., and provision of ecotourism services. Both of these can have negative effects on the environment, but in general they tend to work towards sustainable principles, which also ensure long-term livelihoods and resilience against the effects of climate change. And these tend to occur in areas which are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change, so they can provide more long-term, secure livelihoods in the longer term. Second solution, a bit harder to implement, is the implementation of internal evaluation systems and national certification systems. Cambodia has set up its Green Hotel Awards to try to get its hotels to improve their energy efficiency and improve their use of resources. But countries like Nepal are having problems because they can't get the technical expertise to give organic certification to their products. So perhaps long investments in such facilities could help reduce costs, especially if you're relying on foreign firms to do these things, and also create jobs within the country. And finally, the use of renewables and sustainable management principles like scientifically managed forestry, which you can also use to increase your logging yields, but do so in a sustainable principle, as well as increase incomes through it, but at the same time maintaining, conserving the area. And finally, agriculture. One of the challenges is the choice of biofuels. The issue is that a lot of countries import fossil fuels, and so biofuels are quite an attractive option because they can reduce dependency on fossil fuels, except that the price of biofuels is not stable. It's declined quite a lot for some types like jatropha biofuels, and it also competes in terms of land use with food production, and can also attract foreign firms which have negative, local communities can be quite against in terms of seeing their land access to land being reduced. The second issue that agricultural companies are facing is, again, access to energy. Their remoteness means low grid access levels, so that means that they don't really have much access to energy to begin with, let alone the price of energy being high. And the third issue is standards and labels, again, in terms of requiring some types of certification, which is necessary to increase access to markets. And there's a lot of consumer pressure to follow these standards. For example, organic requirements for some markets are compulsory, basically, and showing that production is low carbon is can be enforced upon by external markets. For example, in the UK, they had the air freight label, which would indicate that the product had high carbon emissions. This was especially relevant to the Kenyan products, which had for which the KFC, the Kenya Flour Council, fought quite hard against to remove the label. So how do they solve this? The first is, in terms of biofuels, there's the issue of dual-use crops. So you can use sugarcane, castor, sorghum, which are not only food crops, but they can also be used to create bioethanol, and you can change use as required, and their price in terms of you can use it for food and you can use it for biofuels, and their price is also much higher than fuel-only crops like jatropha, so it's quite useful for farmers. I mean, the revenues are higher for them if they invest in this. The second thing is the use of sustainable waste and biomass, as well as local renewable endowments for energy. As the case before for Mamiya's Sugar produces energy through its bagasse, KTDA using microhydro locally, Unilever also using microhydro locally. So they're using a lot of, they can use their waste from the products if they've got large enough scale. That's not always the case for some producers. But, and also they can use their own locally available resources. PJ Dave in Kenya has actually one of the largest solar panel power producing plants in the country, and this is a flour producer. It uses it to heat up its flour production processes. And finally, also the implementation of smart agricultural techniques like zero tillage, which improves yield and reduces carbon emissions at the same time, as well as the implementation of national standards to counter foreign imposed standards. Kenya has gained equivalency with Global Gap through the Kenya Gap, which has helped them internalize the standard making process. And at the same time, it's pushed for its own brand, Grown Under the Sun, against the air freight brand to show that its products actually have a lower carbon emission levels than would be publicly perceived without that brand, especially compared to products, to flowers made, for example, in Holland and in Europe. And that's agriculture, just some examples. Yeah, so those are basically the challenges and the solutions that we found from the storyline. So I'll pass back on to Karen.
Very last slide.
Oh, very quick.
Very last, very quick. So basically, we have found that low-income countries do face major threats and opportunities. That was part of our hypothesis. What we've also found is that carbon markets have been a huge disappointment, and a lot of businesses built business cases on carbon markets, expecting them to come through. NGOs and donors also have set up projects with that in mind. They haven't come through almost ever. If they have, then the value is a lot lower than they thought it was going to be. So it's a real shame, and a lot of resources have been put into developing the capacity to tap into carbon markets in developing countries, and it's to no avail to date. And it doesn't look promising for the next 5 years either. So, you know, perhaps money should be spent in other ways to try and capitalise on these other drivers that we've been hearing about, these competitiveness drivers, that the private sector is already doing things. There's a lot of innovation being shown, and there's a lot of scope for lesson learning and a replication of that, which donors could probably support more effectively than focusing on carbon markets in the short run, at least. There are also major trade-offs, which we've heard about. As we've said, that business is tackling some of these key problems through lots of innovative techniques. Things like also the Cool Farm tool that Unilever is developing, which is a way of measuring or doing carbon footprinting by farmers and suppliers, which is solving one of these problems that, you know, carbon markets have been grappling with for a while, how to measure the carbon emissions associated with different agricultural practices. So there's a lot of innovation going on that could really be capitalised on. And so basically my lesson from this is that donors should be thinking a bit more creatively about how they can support some of these processes and work in the grain of what the private sector is already doing.